Welcome to Lesson 3. I'm Steve Jarrard, your host. Email strength2escape@yahoo.com. Our subject matter is the return of Christ. We've been discussing Matthew 24, verse 36. We just finished up. No man knows the day or the hour. I really encourage you to go back and look at all those pertinent scriptures I gave you and view them again. Now, picking up in verse 4, Jesus lists a bunch of things, plural. Talks about false Christ, wars, rumors of wars, nation against nation, famines, earthquakes, false prophets, increase in lawlessness, and the gospel being preached in the whole world. Well, all of these things Jesus was applying toward the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. All these events were actually taking place in the generation that immediately followed Christ's stay here on earth and led up to the destruction of the temple. I go into this in depth in my one-on-one settings, not on the tape. This takes too much time. What we want to look at now is question number 2 in verse 3, Matthew 24:3. What will be the sign of your coming? And I wrote it on the board for you to look at. In Matthew 24, Jesus does not record what the sign is. He alludes to it. He alludes to it in verse 37 with the statement, "For the coming of the Son of Man." So we see that this directly ties in with His coming. "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be." Now when I go into this series, which was one of the 10, we go back to Genesis 6 and Genesis 5, and we find some very interesting phenomena taking place. There are several different teachings and understandings on what happened in those days, particularly the sons of God, the Nephilim, and this mystic character in chapter 5, Enoch. Well, we look at all of that, and we find that today, in modern day right now, in our generation, that we have similar goings on today. And we go into that. It's a little bit controversial. It's something that I don't teach on too often. But that's not the answer to the question, what will be the sign of your coming? He said it'll be like the days of Noah before the flood. Well, think with me for a second. Let's ask a pertinent question. The people before the flood in Noah's day, and before God's wrath was poured out, did they have any indication, time-wise now, of when this flood, that is to say God's wrath, the destruction of all the living, except for certain people, did they have any inkling of time frame? Because Jesus said it's going to be like the days before the flood. So did the people in Noah's day have any idea of when this destruction was coming? And the answer may elude you, but they certainly did. It was the ark. It took Noah over 100 years to build the ark. And as they saw Noah and his sons putting the last planks and caulking as they went, they probably could have figured, if they had faith to believe what he had been preaching to them, that the time was coming very soon. And when they put all the food on board and all the animals were gathered up, it was getting closer. And then the final day when Noah and his family packed up all their tools and their personal belongings and put out their campfire and entered the ark, they should have had some indication time is getting short. And then the next day, they found the door was closed, and Noah didn't close it. God did. Well, there's a whole allusion here to what's going to happen and take place, and the fact that they had an idea of when based on that ark. Well, we have similar testimony today that Jesus is alluding to, but it's not an ark. So what is it? The only answer to the question is found in Luke chapter 21, and the key verse is 24. Now, I'm going to start reading in verse 20, Luke 21:20. Jesus says, "But when you," and the "you" are the disciples who were asking him the question, not us today. "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies." Now notice his language. He said Jerusalem. He's not talking about Dallas, Georgia, or Hiram, or Atlanta, or Chicago, or Tokyo. He very specifically, in his language, is talking to the people standing there who had just asked a question, what was the sign of your coming? When will these things be? And to the end of the age. "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies," and that's not the Palestinians, Russia, and China, or Syria, but rather the Roman legions of Titus in 70 AD, "then recognize that her desolation, Jerusalem's desolation, is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea," notice the language, the geographic location, "those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now he's not talking about the mountains of the Himalayas or the Smokies or the Rockies. He's talking about the mountains that surrounded the city of Jerusalem. "And let those who are in the midst of the city," the city of Jerusalem, he'd already identified that. "Let those who are in the midst of the city depart. Let those who are in the country not enter the city." Well, history tells us that all the Christians who had taken heed of Christ's word had escaped prior to Jerusalem, and not one Christian was left in the city, which Titus ended up, I believe the count was 1.2 million Jews died during the siege, which lasted about 3 years. He says in verse 22, "Because these are days of vengeance, in order that all things which are written may be fulfilled." And let me send you back to a book, Ezekiel chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. Ezekiel prophetically records the events that actually took place in 70 AD, a direct fulfillment of prophecies that God had given Ezekiel. In verse 23, he says, "Woe to those who are with child, and to those who nurse babes in those days." Well, why was that important? Because during the siege, for over 3 years, there was no food in the city. And in Ezekiel, he records that the parents would eat the newborn children, and the afterbirth was cooked and eaten too. And that human dung was the only source of fuel that they had. Dried human dung was used to cook their newborn babies. And their milk, the women's milk, would have dried up, and the babies starved along with the women. And it really affected Titus. He was recorded as actually weeping over the city, over the death, the carnage, when all they had to do was surrender. He didn't want to kill the people, but they were dying by the hundreds of thousands. He goes on to say, for there will be great distress upon the land. There were 3 years of encampment around Jerusalem, and the army had stripped the land of all vegetation. All trees were cut for firewood, for the ramparts, for the breaching of the walls, and there was nothing left. No vegetation, no crops, nothing. And wrath to this people. Now this is a very key word here, very key term. This people. And in a few minutes, probably in our next series, we're going to identify the word this as very critical to our understanding. And of course, this people referring to the Jews who were in Jerusalem, those who would be in the city when it was surrounded by armies and brought to a desolation in a fulfillment of a prophecy in the book of Daniel. And they will fall by the edge of the sword. Of course, that's referring to Titus's sword in 70 AD, which was also prophesied in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. Let me go ahead and read that. Daniel 9:26. This is a prophecy of the coming of Christ. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood of legionaries. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Well, about 2 years before 70 AD, Titus's father, Flavius, was made the Roman emperor, the emperor of Rome, which effectively made his son Titus a prince, literally a prince. Now, picking back up in verse 24, they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led captive into all the nations. Now that captivity is historically known as the dispersion, which took place around 135 AD, where the Jews were sold as slaves throughout the entire Roman Empire, north, south, east, and west. That's how all the lands of today were populated back during the dispersion. That's why we find Jews in all the lands. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until when? Until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Fulfilled means finished, completed. Now, in a minute here, we're going to pause and we're going to pick back up and we're going to find out historically what those Gentile nations, who they were, and when they reigned and ruled, and up until when. Thank you for your interest.